Okay, welcome everybody. What chapters are we supposed to be reading this week? Yeah, apologize. I was complaining about chapter 10 this week, but we're still reading chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 10 is for next week, and the quiz will be on chapters 8 and 9. So if we do one this week, which is very likely. Okay. All right, let's start. Oops, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm wearing my orange and blue jacket today for Ukraine. Also, I got this jacket at a thrift store in The Hague when I was there. I was teaching in Leiden in the Netherlands, and I went to The Hague, which is where the World Court is, as you know, and I was there. I hope that President Putin is there soon. I want to talk today about Denmark Vesey, about the idea of corrupt bargains. This is really the end of the era of good feelings and the beginning of a new party system called this pits the Jacksonians against John Quincy Adams, and people will call the Whigs. And I want to talk a little bit about threats to slavery and the way in which slavery is changing in the period after 1819. Remember that 1819 was a period that we had a financial panic, but people are still moving west, and there's a desire to add new states to the Union. And one of the controversies is over westward expansion. Now, at this point, remember that there was a Federalist Party, but the War of 1812 effectively kills the Federalist Party. No one claims to be a Federalist anymore after 1814, after a couple of years into the War of 1812. And we have the era of good feelings. There's really one party, calls itself the Democratic Republicans. And there are a few people who are kind of continue to be Federalists, sort of in terms of their correspondence with other people. They never use the name publicly after 1814, but they're still kind of outsiders politically. And one of those political outsiders, Rufus King, is going to cause a major controversy. It's connected in part with westward expansion and the creation of new states. Missouri wants to join the Union. It's got enough people to join the Union, but Missouri wants to be a slave state. That is, Missourians vote. Missouri slaveholders and slavers had brought slaves over to Missouri, and this, if you think about the Northwest Ordinance, makes all those green states free states, or that is Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan territory. But Missouri, which is along the Missouri River and goes into the Mississippi River, is a great place for growing hemp, what we now call marijuana. And they're not growing marijuana for its other benefits. They're growing hemp to make rope, to sell rope. But hemp farmers, planters, are enslavers, and they bring slaves over with them. And so there's a controversy about what to do with this state. Shall Missouri become a slave state, kind of wedged next to all these free states? So the controversy gets into Congress, and what we ultimately get is the Missouri Compromise. Missouri becomes a slave state. Maine becomes a free state, and they're entered at the same time. And from now on, until the Civil War starts, there'll be a free state added and a slave state added every time. They'll always be balanced. And at the same time, to resolve any further conflicts, there's going to be a Missouri Compromise line, which is set at 3660 3630, and there will be no slavery above that line for any Western territories. Does that make sense? So Western territories, so Missouri is above 3630, Virginia is above 3630, but for anything further west, there'll be no slavery above that. Okay, so the controversy about adding these free and slave states inspires Rufus King, as this is being discussed. Rufus King, in his 1819 speech against the Missouri Compromise, says, screw this. He opposes slavery. He wants to irritate his Southern planter colleagues in the House, and so he issues a speech in Congress that is a blistering attack on slavery. Now, ordinarily, speeches given by Congress people don't become that necessarily widespread news. But in this period, there's something called the Annals of Congress, which is the sort of proceedings of Congress that are printed. And if you go to any bookstore, and there are a lot of bookstores, that you could buy, believe it or not, the Annals of Congress. And it was a pretty popular publication, as publications go. People would pick up the Annals of Congress to see what was going on. One person who picked up the Annals of Congress and saw Rufus King's speech was a free black man named Denmark Vesey. And in it, he saw confirmation of what he believed, which is that there were many people in the North who did not believe that slavery was right. I'm going to quote from Rufus King here. "Slavery unhappily exists within the United States. Enlightened men in the states where it is permitted, and everyone out of them, regret its existence among us and seek the means of limiting and mitigating it. The first introduction of slaves is not imputable to the present generation, nor even to their ancestors." And he goes back to 1642 to say that slavery is brought in and is a curse, a blot on the Constitution, a blot on the Union. Charleston in 1820, when Denmark Vesey sees this, is a pretty permissive slave place as slavery goes. The coast, as I said before, has malarial mosquitoes, and in the summer months, most enslavers come to Charleston with the people who are called their house slaves. Field slaves are left to work alone in the estates. There are lots of enslaved men, free black men, who have bought their own slavery, and Denmark Vesey has bought their own freedom, but Denmark Vesey is one of them. He's been a carpenter, and through his carpentry work, he's basically bought his own freedom. But there are also many free black men and women, mostly men, but some women as well, who are living out. And what that is they live on their own. They don't have anyone who tells them what to do. They operate their own business, and they pay for themselves as kind of rent to other people. Does that make sense? So they pay a fee every month or every week or sometimes every 6 months to the person who technically owns them. And in exchange, they kind of live on their own in Charleston, where they act as draymen carrying things, as captains on small skiffs, as carpenters, as iron workers, coopers, people who make barrels. And this is a picture. This image is actually probably from around 1860, so it's about 40 years later. But just to kind of give you an impression, there aren't, of course, photographs in the 1820s. Denmark Vesey denied many of the stories that slaveholders told themselves about slavery and freedom. He was, and this is actually, it's a statute made by Ed Dwight, who is a kind of important, interesting character in himself, a black man who was trained for NASA but not allowed to go on space vessel, wasn't allowed to land on the moon. But Denmark Vesey himself, so we really don't know quite what he looked like, but this is just an approximation. He was biracial. That is, that he was a product of a relationship that was supposed to be rare. He was an excellent carpenter, and thus not untrainable and ignorant, as slave apologists said or claimed. He had actually a couple of enslaved wives and enslaved children, which is not the kind of Christian family that many slaveholders believed that they created in the South. His closest friend was Monday Gell, G-E-L-L, a hired out slave who ran his own harness shop. So he was someone who lived out, ran his own harness shop, and paid the person who, quote unquote, owned him with the proceeds. What Vesey did, it's pretty clear, is try to round up enslaved people in Charleston to revolt against their masters, and he used the documents written by Rufus King to say, you have support by many people, North and South, who believe that slavery is wrong. He read them sections of the Declaration of Independence and read them the speech of Rufus King in the Missouri controversy. And over time, he gathered together a small sort of cell of people who were prepared to take over the city of Charleston. This included harbor pilots who were black men who moved ships from one place to another because they knew where all the rocks and shoals were. The plan was to rebel in two stages. First, a dozen black men would raid this building, the Charleston Armory, at night. Every southern state and every major southern city had an armory in it. Athens had an armory in it. And in it were weapons that were to be used in the case of slave revolt, or the case of Indian attack, or in the case of invasion. But it was primarily arsenals at this point, armories at this point were primarily to protect against slave revolts. A dozen black men would raid the arsenal at midnight using clubs, hoes, and pikes. The armory was not actually guarded, and one of the conspirators had a key. Then the plan was that thousands of slaves would take the captured guns. The plan after that was pretty hazy, but some of them spoke of sailing off to Haiti before reinforcements could arrive. In late May of 1822, before this scheduled revolution, Ned Bennett, who was enslaved by the Governor Thomas Bennett, approached a house servant in Bennett's household, and that house servant told Bennett that there was a planned insurrection. And he was originally not believed. Ned Bennett goes to the mayor of Charleston and tells him, this is impossible, this person who works for me can't possibly organize a slave revolt, it's all a misunderstanding. Enslavers in town discussed it and decided it was impossible. Vesey, though uneasy, moved the revolt up 2 weeks, and a few days before the raid was planned, they were turned in again. And at this point, hundreds of white troops were called into Charleston. Vesey sent out a man into the country to tell the countryside recruits to march in, but he was quickly caught by slave patrols. Here was the problem, though, of slavery in a place like Charleston. The men and women who were involved were rounded up. Some were cooks, others were house servants. Elias Horry was a slaveholder who believed that the people that he enslaved would never do such a thing. And when his coachman was accused before constables, he turned to his coachman and said, "Are you guilty?" "Yes," he said. "What were your intentions?" he said. "To kill you, rip open your belly, and throw your guts in your face." In the end, 35 men and women were executed, and 34 deported. The first planned stage was to gather up the weapons in the revolt, and the second planned stage was to go into the countryside and arm black men in the countryside so that they could come back into Charleston. Does that make sense? So the plan is just to get together about 24 people or so, gather together the weapons, bring those out, and then those people would take the weapons and come back into Charleston. That was the plan. There's been some controversy about precisely what happened. Because so many people were killed and because so many people were deported and sent to, some went to Cuba and some went to Louisiana. We don't know precisely what happens, and there is one historian who suggested that there was no real revolt here, but a lot of other historians have suggested that all of the evidence and even the testimony suggests that there was something planned. All right. So this is a slave revolt that kind of never happened, but it definitely changes the way that people in Charleston think about slavery. And in 1822, they pass something called the Negro Seamen's Act, which says that black seamen must wait in jail while they're in Charleston. So if a ship comes in to Charleston and it has seamen in it who are black, they have to wait in jail while the ship is in port, and then they get out of jail and they go back onto the ship. Does that make sense? So that's the Negro Seamen's Act. It's a South Carolina law. It's at this point that many South Carolinians believe that national state that the Constitution has created is a dangerous instrument, in part because people are talking publicly about criticizing slavery publicly. That's being written down, recorded, printed in books, and then coming back to Charleston to potentially incite enslaved people to revolt, right? And so it leads to a kind of paranoia among slaveholders, and this, I don't want to make everything a kind of, cultural, everything a kind of psychological, but it is important. This planned slave revolt is important, and Denmark Vesey becomes a kind of infamous name. It's widely repeated in Charleston. So the Negro Seamen's Act is considered as a constitution is put together. The Supreme Court is pretty sure that this is unconstitutional, that you can't just say every seaman who comes into port, black seaman who comes into port, has to be put in jail. And initially, the Circuit Court, that's one of the Supreme Court members, overturns it. There's a kind of riot. He's almost beaten up. He runs away and goes back to the Supreme Court. And at this point, the Supreme Court is a little bit concerned about what's going to happen to this controversy that's been ginned up in part by the Missouri Compromise and in part by Denmark Vesey. And so that's where Gibbs versus Ogden comes in. And I apologize for having so much text on this, but I think it's helpful to understand this. So this is steamboats, right? And steamboats are, people try to get a lock on steamboats, including some of the wealthiest families, the Dutch New England families, Dutch New York families, like Livingston and others. So they invest in these steamboats, and then they try to make monopolies on them. So Ogden has a New Jersey license that he's paid quite a bit of money for, and he's competing with this person called Gibbs, who's operating a steamboat between New Jersey and New York. Gibbs says that he doesn't need to because the Federal Coasting Act says that there can't be monopolies in states. Ogden then has Gibbs arrested in New York and sent back to New Jersey for trial. Gibbs sues, and it finally goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is like a part-time job in the 1820s. Supreme Court people don't have a whole lot to do because not a lot of cases end up in the Supreme Court. But when you have one state against another state, that's definitely Supreme Court territory, and so this goes up. And Gibbs wins in 1824 in Gibbs versus Ogden. It's very important. The Supreme Court is trying to kind of slice this, sausage as thin as you possibly can. The argument is that if the federal government has legislation, then it triumphs over state legislation, right? So if the federal government has something about traveling along the coast, and the state government has something about traveling along the coast, the federal government wins, right? But, and this is crucial, if a state has a regulation and there's no federal regulation to match it, the state gets to do it at once. Does that make sense? And so what that does is allow the Negro Seaman Act to continue, even though it's pretty clearly unconstitutional, right? Unlawful search and seizure, there's all sorts of explanations that you could make for why the Negro Seaman Act is a problem. But the Gibbs versus Ogden slices this very thin, and it says that there's federal legislation wins. State legislators can do whatever they want, as long as it doesn't interfere with federal legislation. So some people call this Emancipation Proclamation for American business, because in the United States, it really eliminates monopolies, a lot of state monopolies that existed. A lot of drawbridges and monopolies on steamboats and things like that had emerged in a bunch of states, and basically those are blown away because there is this Federal Coasting Act. But implied is that the Seamen's Act and other Southern state controls on the enslaved is okay because there is no federal legislation. The fear, though, on the part of slaveholders is there will be federal legislation on the question of slavery. That, for example, in the internal slave trade, that the federal government might say people have to be fed on the way so that they don't starve. People can't be wearing chains. They have to, So the federal government could do something like that, and so the Congress and Southerners become much, much more keen on what's going on in the federal government because they see this threat. They want, in fact, some of them want to be able to nullify federal legislation because they fear that federal power will be used against them. Others don't want to risk federal action. They just want to keep quiet about it. They just want things to settle down. Okay, after 1819, as I've suggested, cotton becomes a more and more important part of the economy. And that's in part because the US can't export grain anymore to the Caribbean, right? It can, but it has to go all the way up to Halifax and then all the way back down in British boats. So it's technically possible, but it's very difficult for it to get there. There's some grain that's actually smuggled from New York over the St. Lawrence River to Montreal and then turned into British flour and things like that. But it's just become much harder to sell grain to the Caribbean that way. And Europe is really too far away to sell flour to. It gets spoils too quickly. And so what we see is much more of a cotton economy because Britain has no tariff, has no limitation on cotton coming in. There's lots of limitations on grain or flour coming in. But what we see is a boom and bust economy because what happens is there's a whole lot of money that goes into Mississippi. A whole bunch of enslavers set up shop there. They start to grow wheat in Mississippi, and then the price of wheat drops. The price of cotton drops. And then a bunch of, so it's a boom, and every commodity has this function. Wheat prices, cotton prices, any big commodity that's traded internationally has this problem, but cotton is especially boom and busty, and you can see that here in cotton prices, right? They go from 11 cents in 1812 to 30 cents in 1820, and then back to 14 cents in 1823, and then back up to 20 cents and so that's a lot. That's a huge change in the relative price of things, a 40% increase, 80% drop, that sort of thing. And so there are, I wrote on the bottom there are surges of westward movement in the South from 1816 to 1820, from 1832 to 1838, and they get it in the mid-1850s. And what happens is people surge into these regions, they produce a lot of cotton, and then the cotton prices go down. Does that make sense? Two questions, sorry. Oh, how does Gibbs versus Ogden imply that the Negro Seamen's Act is okay? Let me go back to that for a second. Basically, the Negro Seamen's Act is a regulation on black men on ships, and there's no regulation of black men on ships. That's a federal law. So the Negro Seamen's Act stands because it's a state law, but there's no federal act to counteract it. In Gibbs but in the steamboat case, there was a federal law. There was a state law that said you can have a monopoly, and a federal law that said you can't have a monopoly, and so the federal law stands. So it's implied that the Negro Seamen's Act and other state regulation, what they call police powers, basically policing enslaved people, that's all legitimate as long as there's no other thing. What did cotton replace? Cotton replaced wheat. So wheat was the big export, and this is not in the textbook and it's not in most books, but it's true, that wheat is one of the biggest exports in the United States from the 1780s all the way until 1820. And because wheat is barred, wheat and flour are barred from the Caribbean, Americans can't sell wheat to the Caribbean without going through Halifax. Wheat declines in importance and cotton increases in importance because cotton is not limited by tariffs, British tariffs, imperial tariffs. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's wheat and cotton. So this is what the cotton economy looks like. It's crazy, right? It's up and down like, and it's a boom and bust economy. And if you think about, I don't like to think about buying and selling people as a kind of enterprise, but let's just think about it for a second. Buying and selling people to produce things, which is what happens in slavery, introduces a tremendous amount of instability because people are bought based on the value of the commodity they're producing. So this line at the top is cotton prices, and this line at the bottom is slave prices, right? This is what the price of enslaved people is. And you see it goes up and down just like cotton prices. So that means that if you're an enslaved person and cotton prices go up, slave prices are going to go up, and it's more likely your family is going to be broken up. If cotton prices go down, it's also a possibility because the person who owns you might go bankrupt, in which case all of the people that they quote unquote own will be sold. So it's a boom and bust cycle that is, as you can imagine, disturbing for enslavers, and is much more disturbing for enslaved people because it helps to produce this economy in which the continuity of your family is in question, whether there's a boom or a bust. Because suddenly you're worth more, and perhaps more likely to be sold off down the river. Okay. So after the Panic of 1819, there is era of good feeling is over, and the election of 1824, 1820 is basically pretty much sewed up at the end of the 1819 Panic, before it really fully reaches its peak. But in 1824, people are pissed about what happened. Who to blame? Do you blame the British? Do you blame the Bank of the United States, Second Bank of the United States, which seemed to clamp down on these some of these banks in Kentucky and places like that? Who do you blame for this controversy? And basically, you get four factions. And this is a cartoon from around 1825. And I'll try to explain it to you here, or if you look at it here. So there are kind of four different caucuses. There is, on the left, the Crawford caucus. And Crawford is a South Carolina banker. He's actually in charge of the Treasury Department in the middle of the 1819 Panic. He was involved in closing down some of these banks. Closing down those banks destroyed the fortunes of the people who had notes, that is banknotes, from those very banks. And so some people blamed him for the financial downturn. He blames speculation. He blames Britain. He blames everyone else but himself for this controversy. And he is an extreme states' rights person. Extreme states' rights. He's from Charleston, South Carolina, right? He's been at the center of this Vasey controversy. And so on the one hand, he's a banker. On the other hand, he's extremely states' rights. And one of the things that he says, and this is why I think it's interesting, and again, I want to suggest that the kind of multiracial democracy that's here, it's not perfect by any means. It's incredibly difficult, but there's something to it. Crawford believes that the solution to the Indian problem is for white people to marry Indians, and their children will become important citizens in the American West. All right. So this is so, but he's on the other hand extremely states' rights, and he wants to be able to nullify individual state laws. And Crawford has a stroke in the middle of the election, and people who are his supporters, who are called radicals, say now he's the perfect president because he can't do anything. Right? This is the perfect president because presidential power and executive national power should be weak. And so a president with a stroke who can't do anything is a perfect president. This is creepy, right? Weird. And he does win in some states, even though he can barely talk. All right, that's Crawford. Then there's Henry Clay. Henry Clay is a riverboat gambler. He had been trained actually by George Wythe, W-Y-T-H-E, who was the kind of most famous legal teacher in the United States. He is the person who trained John Marshall. Henry Clay believes in a strong national government. He believes in internal improvements, steamboats and canals and things like that. This is before railroads really exist. He believes that northern and southern capitalists should join hands together to make a strong state. He believes in tariffs, particularly tariffs against Russia, because Russia is also producing hemp, producing rope, and the fear is that American hemp won't do as well as Russian hemp, and so he wants a tariff to block Russian rope. His claim is that those people in Russia are enslaved who are producing this. It's a bizarre logic, but why do people dislike Crawford again? Okay, yeah. So let's. That's a great question, and let's go back to this image then, just to understand what the criticism of Crawford is, right? So he's a grandfather who's holding dollars, and he says, "Here's a bowl full of solid papoose meat. Better marry our wild Indians than foreigners, good or bad." And you see there's this man and presumably his daughter who's sitting, and there's a child who's biracial, half European, half Indian, and the Indian dad who's there. And so this is, but you see behind him it says Uncle Sam's Treasury, Pap House, right? The Pap House is what you feed a baby. And so this is basically all the horrible things about a strong centralized federal government. At the same time that Crawford himself is, is a states' rightist. So this is this is the cartoon that's pitched against Crawford. Crawford is extreme states' rights, but also associated with the Treasury. Okay, the Adams Caucus. There are a bunch of dogs, and each dog is named after. I haven't spoken about Adams, so sorry. Let me explain all the other guys. Okay, so that's William H. Crawford and Henry Clay. All right, and then we have Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And Jackson is a warrior general. He's won a bunch of battles, including the Battle of New Orleans. He's driven the Red Sticks, a kind of community of Creek, out of the South. He's bombed the Negro Fort, which is basically a place in Tallahassee or near Tallahassee where enslaved people were escaping to. The British allowed them to settle there. They lived as free men in near Tallahassee, and Andrew Jackson bombs the fort and kills almost everyone in it because he hits the powder magazine. So this is Andrew Jackson, a soldier. And then John Quincy Adams, who's a son of John Adams and a statesman who has his own problems. He wants to create a single national university, and he wants that university to be Harvard, where he went to school. He wants lighthouses because there are a lot of rocky coasts in New England, and he thinks that there ought to be lighthouses. He thinks there ought to be astronomical observatories. He's sees himself as a scientist. He's a professor. People call him the professor. He's not really, doesn't have a PhD. He spits when he talks. I don't know. That's all I got. So that's John Quincy Adams. The four of them are the four candidates for president. And the Adams caucus, the criticism of them is that Hartford Convention, that was the convention, remember, you saw in the book, where New England had talked about separating from the United States, creating their own organization. They're called blue lights because they supposedly flashed blue lights in New England to attract British ships in the middle of the War of 1812. So basically supporting the enemy. The blue light is this kind of symbol of supporting the enemy. And the Southeast, this is a little harder for Jackson to attack Clay because they're both from the West, but he has a dog with scalps that say Amalgamation Instruments, WHC, that's a reference to Crawford. So those are the three candidates. And this is the election. And in the election, it's a four-way tie. That is, nobody gets 50% of the votes. The highest electoral share is 38%, and that goes to Jackson. But you can't just give the election to Jackson. They're all in the same party, right? And so Jackson gets 38%. Adams is second, Crawford and Clay. Well, according to the Constitution, the way that this is resolved, this question is resolved, is it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives decides in consultation with the Senate who is going to be president. And who is the head Speaker of the House? Henry Clay. But Henry Clay is fourth, right? So he can't make himself president. But he sits down in a private meeting with John Quincy Adams, and they come to an agreement inside a carriage, and no one knows precisely what happens, but it turns out that Adams and Clay come to some agreement. Clay returns and makes Adams president. Makes John Quincy Adams president. He persuades the House and the Senate that the person who got the second number, 32% of the vote, should be president. And he's allowed to do that. This is called the corrupt bargain. And this is the creation of the second party system. Because Andrew Jackson initially accepts the vote and then gets more and more pissed the more he thinks about it. Can I talk more about Adams? Yeah, he's called the professor. He spits when he talks. He's kind of an intellectual. And he's going to become basically this new party is going to merge behind Andrew Jackson, and it starts the day of the 1824 election. Starts the day after the 1824 election when Adams wins and Jackson loses. And the new party is going to be everything that John Quincy Adams isn't, right? Everything that John Quincy Adams isn't is going to be this new Democratic Party. And they're going to take on that term Democrat. They're going to call themselves Democrat. The architect of this is a Dutch man named Martin van Buren. He's the architect of this new second party system. And he says, look, there is a north-south tension. We saw it in the compromise, the Missouri Compromise. We need to fix this. And so he comes up in his brain with this new idea that's going to mix, basically put Northerners and Southerners in the same party. Northern Democrats who don't like tariffs, people in New York. Southern Democrats who blame the Bank of the United States for their problems. And then John Quincy Adams and New England who want tariffs and internal improvements. Those people will be in the other party. In the end, Crawford Southerners who want the second Bank of the United States because they need the capital, are also going to go in this other party. The safe issues in the second party system are Democrats versus John Quincy Adams, anti and pro tariffs. Democrats opposed to tariffs. Adams supporters support tariffs. Anti and pro internal improvements. Democrats oppose internal improvements like railroads or canals as federal instruments. The John Quincy Adams folks support them. Western land prices. Democrats said they should be even lower. People in the Adams Party say they should be higher. For the second bank, the Adams folks, I got it backwards there. The Democrats oppose the second bank of the United States. The Adams folks support it. And finally, Eastern businessmen. Who's to blame for your problems? It's Adams. And all the Eastern businessmen and all the Yankees are responsible for your problems. And what you get in that new Democratic Party then is workers in New York who are not happy. Why were tariffs so important? Tariffs aren't actually that important, but it's a safe issue. Slavery is a dangerous issue. Slavery will divide people north and south, and slavery will, Van Buren thinks, lead to civil war. Tariffs are a relatively minor issue. Tariffs are how much you block foreign imports. And the US does block a lot of foreign imports. It started to do that in 1818. That's the reason that Britain responded with these things. But in general, you can say that Southerners don't like tariffs because they have to pay them, right? They have to pay for all their foreign goods from abroad, and the people who benefit them by tariffs are Easterners, allegedly, who are manufacturing things and whatnot. It's a kind of a fake issue. It's not as big an issue as it sounds, but it becomes a safe issue, and an issue that people can argue about, and an issue that doesn't lead people to pull out their guns. Does that make sense? So this is the genesis of the second party system. Whew. All right. Brucey. Okay. Okay, and if you think about it as points in the compass, the Jackson faction is mostly the South and Southwest. The Crawford faction is the Southeast, right? Those are the bankers and planters who depend on the bank for their support. They believe in the Treasury. They believe in a strong, they believe in a Treasury department. They believe in a second bank of the United States. They are strongly states' rights, and this is a little confusing because people think that the Democrats are the big supporters of states' rights, but that's not initially true. You can see that Clay is strongest in what's basically the Northwest, Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio, and Adams is an extremely sectional president. He's entirely in the Northeast, only in New England. Okay. And we're going to talk about how this fight over the corrupt bargain leads us to the second party system and Jackson's victory. But I now want to do a quiz. So, thanks for bearing with me on that. All right, the quiz is open. It's there until 11:20. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great, I'll see you on Friday.